I'm so excited to be here, and thank you to Voxel 51 also for inviting me to join this amazing panel. I work on the intersection of clinical research, data, and AI. And today I'll be presenting from the perspective of strategy and product development with a focus on how AI can lower barriers to healthcare access. So in contrast to my co-panelists, this is a 50,000 foot view into AI in healthcare. And I'll be sharing experiences in building an AI program from ground up in oncology and radiology. A couple of disclosures here. I offer consultancy services in ideation, business development, fundraising, strategy, roadmap development, cross-domain and cross-functional collaboration. And I have worked with a lot of pharma companies and biotech and life sciences, as well as nonprofits, academia, and FDA. So before we dive in, let me give you a quick roadmap of what we will be covering today. I have a very broad agenda, thinking from the broad audience perspective. And my objective here from this talk is, to give a general understanding of the landscape of AI in healthcare and to generate curiosity and questions. So I'll be talking about technology development in healthcare, some major milestones, a brief overview of my own professional journey in the last 15 plus years. And then finally, I'll be talking about AI innovations in healthcare with focus on oncology. And I'll be spending most of my time in on that third bullet. So let's get right into it. And so I want to start with some examples of technology innovations in healthcare in the last 50 years. And so the electronic health records that you see today are very sophisticated, but the earliest form of EHR is known to be from 1950s, and that's when it was first sort of launched. But now you have much more sophisticated version of EHR, in the form of Epic and Cerner's and AthenaCare and many more. The next sort of evolution in technology was clinical decision support tools. And I really want to give credit to academia here. The earliest clinical decision support prototypes were rolled out by academia and later adopted on a larger scale. So CDS tools play a key role in real-time assistance in personalized patient care, as you just heard and saw many examples of those applications in my previous co-panelists here. Another example is telemedicine, and you have probably already seen the wide adoption of telemedicine during pandemic, and that it helps facilitate the remote consultation and again, patient care and personalized care. The next one in the last a decade or so, or maybe 15 years, there's major advancement in imaging technology. That includes CT scans, MRIs, X-rays, and ultrasound machines. And although in the early stages of that evolution that we used to have 2Ds and black and white images, but those have come a long way in the recent years. Now we have 3D images, and we can have lots and lots of information and features available in those images that you can then use through using technology and AI to decipher from and help in diagnostics and treatment. And last but not the least are the wearable devices that also offer real-time monitoring of parameters and conditions in patients. So I just wanted to give you a brief overview and perspective from where I'm coming from. I'm a biophysicist by training. I worked, part of my PhD thesis was at National Institutes of Health. And then my introduction into the clinical research started with me working at on this program, Cancer Bioinformatics Grid, with Booz Allen Hamilton back in the day. It was funded by National Cancer Institute. And then during my days at Duke University, I had an opportunity to work in healthcare IT, and where I had opportunity to work both in real world data, electronic health record, and developing clinical decision support tools, as well as working with clinical research and clinical trial data. And you have to really understand this, that clinical research and trial data is used to evaluate safety and efficacy and optimal use of drugs and medical devices and treatment strategies. And it's a highly regulated field, guided by strict standards and oversights. So it is important to keep that in mind while we are using and developing any tools and technologies in clinical research. And last one is healthcare AI. Last 6 years, I was working with Project DataSphere, and that is where I spent most of my time in developing this program where we built an AI-enabled medical device in oncology and radiology setting. And so for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on that number 4th bullet here. So let's get right into it. So healthcare AI, what is that? It is an application of machine learning and deep learning and natural language processing to address real-world challenges in medicine and public health. So there are a variety of use cases here that in which AI can be used. Some of them are accurate diagnosis or personalized treatment plan, enhanced patient care through remote monitoring. You've seen those examples in the previous panelists' presentations. Also accelerating discovery pipeline in drug research and development, and then making operations more efficient. A recent report from Duke Health indicated that the most effective use of AI that they found in their clinic operations was streamlining surgery schedules. And as you can imagine, that optimizing that schedule is a highly manual and laborious process, but it's a perfect sort of use case for AI to do, and it did a really great job, cheaper, better, and much faster. Now I want to go into the little bit more about and talk about what does it take to build an AI innovation team, and what are the key ingredients, and who are the key stakeholders. And I'm going to talk about that in the next 2 slides. So there are 5 pillars that are required for AI innovation in healthcare setting. The first one is data access. For you to do any kind of data development of tool in AI, you need high quality of data, and it is important that it is a diverse data set that you have access to. In terms of in context of healthcare, that means medical records, high quality of medical records, imaging data, genomics data, pathology data, clinical trial data, as well as administrative data. Collaboration is key. And so, working with various stakeholders within that context, in the healthcare context, is important. That includes researchers and industry partners, as well as regulatory experts. And then collaboration and domain expertise goes hand in hand. So working with software engineers and healthcare professionals and other therapeutic area experts, collaborating with them is really important. And then funding, of course, is key also in developing a program. So, partnering with funding agencies, whether it is uh, venture investors or pharma investors or government funded grants. Those are also key points to consider as you are developing a program. And last one but not the least, as I mentioned before, regulatory compliance is important, and the earlier you engage with regulatory experts, the more smoother is the adoption later in the development and adoption phase, implementation phase. So let's dig a little bit deeper into who are the key stakeholders of AI, healthcare AI, and why do we need to pay attention to that. So the key is that you need to have buy-in from all key stakeholders during the entire development cycle, as well as um, um, as you are developing this program, you can utilize their expertise as a sounding board while you develop your go-to-market strategy. First and foremost is patients. Our patients, they are the North Star and center of all the efforts that you do. So it is important that that is the center of your all the processes and all the things that you are doing are sort of catered towards that your ultimate goal is to serve patients, accelerate patient care, and diagnosis. The next few stakeholders are healthcare providers, which includes hospitals, doctors, nurses, and medical professionals. Pharmaceutical companies and industry partners are also key stakeholders in this ecosystem, as well as academic researchers who are often come in at a forefront and a cutting edge part of the entire roadmap. So the way we build the program is that you work with researchers, academic researchers, to build a proof of concept sort of AI, research grade AI. And then once you like and the specificity and sensitivity and performance of AI, then you move that into production and work with technology partners to productize that AI tool, which then once that is optimized, then you work with the regulatory bodies to get clearance and do testing against the blinded data sets and validate those results. And then finally, you introduce that in the clinical setting and integrate it into clinical workflows. So keeping that pipeline in mind, those are the key stakeholders that we must keep in mind. So let's talk about, what does it take to build an AI-enabled medical device. And here I will give you an example of in oncology use case where we were trying to automate RECIST. And so in context of Auto-RECIST, building an AI tool that can, let me take a step back. So give you a very broad overview of what is RECIST. So RECIST is a process by which a radiologist sits in front of the computer and looks at CT scans, and they measure the CT scans and lesions. They measure the lesions in the CT scans at the baseline. Then the patient is put on the drug treatment, and on the follow-up time points, you look at the new CT scans to see the size of the tumor, whether or not it is increasing in size or staying the same or decreasing in the size. And based on that, then you analyze and see whether or not the treatment is working. In order for us to do that, there are 7 key milestones that you should keep in mind. First and foremost is data collection. And I talked earlier that, heterogeneity of data is important. For us in context of Auto-RECIST, we had data sets gathered from both real world data, which is Columbia Health System, as well as two clinical trials from Amgen data sets. So it's important to have access to heterogeneous data sources that helps develop the AI, robustness of AI. Developing gold standard data set is also very, that's the second most important step there, which is, so in our project, we work with radiologists who developed gold standard data sets, and that was then used for training. Depending on the method that you utilize, you can either do supervised or unsupervised or reinforcement machine learning. In our case, we took an approach of supervised AI machine learning. And then there is AI model development and fine-tuning and evaluation, which requires you to do data partitioning in training, test, and validation. And then productization of the AI tool and then validating it against the blinded data set is also an important step, which then leads to the regulatory clearance. And then the final step is deployment and monitoring. It is really important to make sure that as you are deploying the model, that it is being monitored post-deployment. And something to keep in mind is the data drift. So often that, the model is trained on a specific data set. Let's say in our example, 6,000 patients, but as you deploy it, over time, there may be migration and data drift in the patient population that the AI sees. So constant, continuous monitoring of AI is really important and something to keep in mind. So here are some general examples of and advantages of AI-enabled medical devices. So first and foremost is automation. As you saw, tumor burden assessment. It is a highly laborious and manual process, but deploying AI and using AI to do that is, a much better use of radiologists or oncologists' time. So, AI can do preliminary analysis and present that to radiologists, which then radiologists can then use as a guide and additional and do their own final assessment in the process of their assessment. Accuracy and precision in diagnostics is another sort of use case where AI is used. Personalized treatment plans, for example, detecting coronary arteries blockage. One of our panelists talked about that. Predictive analytics in tumor growth is another use case. And then operational efficiencies and speed, following through the processes and replacing or aiding the manual process and doing things better, cheaper, faster. It's a perfect use case for AI. Continuous monitoring devices like glucose monitoring is another example of AI implementation. And then last one but not the least is reducing barriers to healthcare in utilizing the power of AI to lift and reduce the barrier of access to healthcare in underserved population. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the later part of my talk. This is a paper that we published. This was a AI research grade AI in liver. and where we developed an AI module that could detect and measure lesions in liver. Our next step in that roadmap is to we have already actually developed that, which is a lung module. We haven't published a paper on that, and then the third step is to develop an AI module in lymph nodes, and combined lung, liver, and lymph node can cover 85% of solid tumors in metastatic cancer. So that would be the NMVP to introduce into the clinical research workflows at CROs. So I wanted to give you an example of AI and how that could be used to reduce barriers in access to healthcare. So in 2024, a group of 10 researchers and scientists came together and made a trip and trekking in Himalayas on a medical expedition. And there were three objectives to that trip. The first one was to innovate an X-ray machine that is portable. And so it's not something that can be operated on batteries, and that's something that you could put in your backpack and trek with it. And then the second objective was to enable that X-ray machine with AI. So then so when you run the X-ray machine and an AI report comes with it, so then it assists the healthcare providers in looking at the report and seeing what are all the anomalies that are associated with that X-ray. And then the third one was objective was to deploy that device in the most remotest regions on the planet to showcase that if you can deploy it in the harshest conditions on the planet, then you can in theory do it anywhere else also. So that was the group. We trekked for 11 days and started from Lukla and trekked all the way to the Everest base camp. And then on the final day, we trekked another 1,000 feet to go to Kalapathar, which is the highest peak where an AI device has ever been deployed. And this is just a short video. Yeah, so that was just a short video showing that, that was the highest altitude at which we were able to deploy this AI device. And in doing so, we also made a Guinness World Record. And just to give credit to my colleagues there, Jay Bassi and Mike Kearney and myself here in the group, along with the Sherpa. And then this is the full group of 10 trekkers with 10 Sherpas that joined, was the full group that went to the Everest Base Camp. Anyhow, to close out, to conclude this conversation, AI, of course, has the potential to revolutionize healthcare and improve diagnostics and treatments and patient care. There are a few next steps and things that are still needed to be done, and there's a lot of research that is going on that is supporting that. For example, we do need some more clarity from the regulatory perspective and standardization of, the data that will be used. For example, use of synthetic data in AI, in developing AI-enabled medical devices. When is it okay? Is it okay to use synthetic data set for training or validation? So that it'd be good to have some guidance there. Integration into clinical workflows and PACS system, if there are any, a lot of groups are working on it, and then, development of best practices and guidelines there would be also very helpful to research and product development community. Trust and transparency is key. And so a lot of product developers are developing AI, explainable AI, which are really important. Scaling of AI for clinical trials and drug development is another thing that has been worked on right now. And then the broad adoption of AI-powered imaging tools like Auto-RECIST and digital pathology, that is something that's going to happen in the next 5 years, along with personalized medicine, and then using AI to serve underserved population. And last one, but not the least, is patient is the front and center of all of this. And so making sure that as we are doing this and adopting technology, that we always keep that in mind. So with that, those are my slides. I'd love to, hear your thoughts and questions, whether here or offline. Happy to connect.
Fantastic. So let's take a couple of questions before we close out, and I'll try to summarize these. The first one is going to be when you were initially discussing your slides around RECIST. One of the points that you made was that one of the bottlenecks is simply around scheduling. What is your take in regards to the optimizations that can be made around scheduling, I guess, in all its forms that it comes when you're dealing with a healthcare system, and what role AI may play in being able to streamline that particular bottleneck?
So I was talking about scheduling as an example from Duke Health Report, where they reported recently that in their Epic system, in their clinic system, they looked at a lot of different use cases and to deploy AI. And one of the ones that they found really helpful was operational efficiencies. And then the current state of the art is that, it's a highly laborious process, and that, a coordinator looks at the schedule and matches it, and, it's constantly changing. And so large language model enables the analysis and the real-time adjustment in the schedule that makes it really efficient.
Let's take another question, and I'll try to summarize this one as well. There was a couple of questions in regards to HIPAA compliance and the usage of LLMs. So from your observation post, how do you see the healthcare industry navigating that balance? Maybe it's not a balance because it has to be done, the regulatory and compliance piece with getting these models access, or researchers getting access to data to take advantage of some of these advancements that other industries perhaps are not so as burdened, shall we say, in getting access to the data.
That's right. And it goes back to my, comments in the last slide about next steps and standardization in the regulatory industry, that we need more standardization and guidance from regulatory bodies like FDA to kind of, explain and give us the guardrails as to, in what forms and shape that LLMs could be used in the research and development, whether it is at academic level or the product development level. So in the Auto-RECIST example that I gave, which was mostly, which was all of it was classical machine learning. And so we did not use large language model in that example. But going forward, as you know, yes, large language models will be part of AI enabled medical devices, but we need, as far as I know, there hasn't been, the most recent guidelines from FDA did not include guidelines on use of large language models, and I'd like to see more of that.
Then we'll take one last question, and with the disclaimer is that I'm not aware that anyone on the panel is a lawyer, but it's still an interesting question that came up a few times in different formats, which was a question around liability, and especially in healthcare, where I think it's safe to say that you are more likely to encounter life or death situations than, say, in other industries where an AI or machine learning product or system may spit out some sort of advice or recommendation on an action to take. But when an AI system is making a recommendation to, for example, a doctor, and he implements that, from your vantage point, where are we in regards to eventually resolving some of the legal challenges that we may experience in regards to AI as it relates to outcomes? And I guess I should caveat that just slightly with the understanding, as we saw in yesterday's presentation, one of the points that was made is that we have to live in a reality where doctors, nurses, and healthcare practitioners have been using Google for a while, and some of them are actually using things like Claude and OpenAI to better understand or look up information, et cetera. So we live in a reality where they're just like everybody else. They use these technologies to augment their knowledge base, but when it actually becomes a determinant factor in making a decision, well, there can be life or death consequences. What's your take on the liability issues or the legal ramifications of these technologies?
Yeah, I can take that on that question, or at least start with my response. In developing Auto-RECIST, we thought long and hard about this issue, about introducing AI in the medical practice, or our ambitious goal was, can AI replace radiologists? And we talked with regulators and also researchers and radiologists and oncologists, and landed that, at least now, the technology isn't at a place where it can replace radiologists or oncologists, but would be an aid to radiologists. And therefore, also when we are submitting, as we were developing the regulatory pathway and roadmap for this device, that question came up a lot, and we decided that this would be an aid to radiologists rather than replacing radiologists in doing the secondary evaluation, secondary reader evaluation in RECIST. As you pointed out, Jimmy, that their practitioners already use AI or technology, whether it's Google or Claude or whatever it is. I mean, back in the day it was books, and now it's Google, and now it's more recently it's Claude. But there needs to be education and at all levels, and as some of these large language models do have the tendency to hallucinate, so it is really important to kind of have that knowledge as clinicians are looking at the responses that are given by specifically large language models at this point. I know that as we have developed the AI-enabled medical devices using classical machine learning techniques, that problem doesn't exist that much because it has been trained and validated and evaluated and fine-tuned against blinded data sets. And, so there are more guardrails there compared to, I guess, in large language model use cases.